Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is Daily Drop number 176. Tonight we have an article from the Daily Mail, and it has to do with a girl who overdosed on heroin after being one of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse victims. Now, I talk about this quite a bit on the podcast about the girls that we've never heard about, the unnamed girls, the ones that, have been abused by Epstein and his ring, and they haven't been in the public eye. They might not have been part of a lawsuit, or they've chosen to remain in the background for whatever reason, or they might have settled out of court with Jeffrey Epstein, or it might have just been somebody who has slipped through the cracks. Well, in tonight's article, we're going to hear from this girl's twin sister and the family, and how the abuse at the hands of Jeffrey Epstein led directly to her spiraling out of control. And we know it's more prevalent than we've heard. There's definitely more cases like this out there of girls who were caught up in Jeffrey Epstein's web and who were abused and who were trafficked by him to his rich, famous friends and abused by him, himself. These are the girls that, they have not come forward for whatever reason, or they've just slipped through the cracks, or, whatever the reason may be. We know that there has to be a ton more of these kind of girls out there, because what Jeffrey Epstein was up to, we know how prolific he was with the activities that he was engaged in. If reports can be believed, 3 a day, you do the math there, we're talking about 90 girls a month. Were they all the same girls all the time? No, we know that they weren't. So I'm sure that there are a lot more girls out there who share stories such as this girl in the article tonight, and have also suffered great tragedy and battled through all sorts of mental illness and PTSD and all sorts of other ailments that go along with suffering such trauma at the hands of somebody like Jeffrey Epstein. So it's nice to hear one of these stories, not so much the content, obviously, but it's good to get these stories out there because it brings awareness to other girls who might not have, told their stories yet, right? And this is a very tricky situation for a lot of these girls. I'm sure a lot of them don't want to come out and publicly speak and have all that attention and have to answer questions and be mobbed by newspapers and, all of that stuff. I'm sure a lot of these girls have been able to compartmentalize this, at least to the degree where they can at least function and go through life, as normal as possible. Whereas there's other girls who, I'm sure this is just something that they have not been able to get over, even with therapy and going to speak to a professional, a mental health professional, and a trauma specialist. Sometimes it's a hurdle that can't be jumped. It's a very difficult task to come out of a dark place like that. And I'm sure there are a lot of girls that have fallen into that sort of abyss where there just doesn't seem to be any hope and any light, and they turn to drugs, right? They turn to drugs and they turn to self-destructive behavior, and that's human nature. And, when the trauma has been that heavy, you can't even judge people when they look for that escape, they look for that release. They've been abandoned by the justice system, they've been abandoned by, the authorities, and you can't really blame them, and you have to look at them with empathy when they turn to something like this, because really what they're saying and what this is signaling is that they're at the end of the rope, right? They don't know where to turn, they can't get help, nothing has helped them, and all they're looking for is to dull the pain. So a lot of people that suffer this sort of trauma, they end up becoming drug addicts, and they end up having destructive behavior control their lives. And that's what we're going to see in this article. And I think it's poignant and it's very important, because I know for a fact that there are so many other girls like this in this case and in other cases as well, right? Not just with Jeffrey Epstein, but other people who have suffered this sort of abuse and who have not, come forward, and who they have suffered not only the abuse but the the after effects of that abuse and what it has done to them going forward in their lives, and how it's hindered them trying to move forward with a happy life. The things that we just take for granted, right? The pursuit of happiness, being able to, wake up every morning, and even though you're stressed or whatever, you're able to, focus on, what you have to do, what's good in your life, et cetera, et cetera. For people that have suffered this kind of trauma, well, there seems like there's no hope. There's no getting out of that hole. And then they get sucked into the depression aspect of it and the drug use, and it's just bad news. So when we have an article like this, when the families are willing to come forward and share an article like this, even though it's painful to read, right, and brutal to read, it's something that needs to be talked about. It's something that needs to be added to the catalog, and it's a very vital part of the story, because when you see Virginia and Annie and Maria and the rest of the gals coming forward, they're they're fighting for these girls as well, right? The girls that maybe haven't had a chance to come forward, or have ended up overdosing on drugs, or who have killed themselves, or whatever it may be. They never had a chance to have their voices heard. So when these girls come forward that are, that are still with us, and who have been able to battle through this and soldier on, and they've been able to face down their own demons and come out victorious, when they come out and they come forward and they speak on these topics, it's not just about them, really, right? It's about these girls that don't have a voice either. And I'm not going to speak for the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, but the ones who have come forward, they have taken that great burden upon their shoulders, and they're leading the charge for the ones who don't have a voice. Because there was a time when these girls, they didn't have a voice either. Nobody listened to them either. So now that they have a platform, they're bravely standing up to the powers that be, and they're telling them, look, we're going to speak out on what happened to us, and we're going to speak out for all of the girls that couldn't speak out, and we're going to demand justice. And what you see here is families now of girls that have lost their lives due to overdoses, etc. They're coming out and they're adding their voice to the collective now. And this is very powerful stuff, and it's very important that we talk about it. So this article is from the Daily Mail, and the headline is, "Exclusive. She suffered tremendously, and it started with Jeffrey Epstein. Twin sister of woman who overdosed on heroin years after being abused by financier, pedophile, as a teen, blames her downward spiral and death on the billionaire pedophile." And from that headline alone, it tells you what the article entails, right? It tells you what the article is going to be about. And we can see and we understand, because we've seen it time and time again in cases like this, how the spiral begins. This young girl comes into his web, gets abused by him, and then she, her mental state is fractured by it, and rightfully so. You go through a traumatic experience like that, it's going to shake anybody at their core, at their foundation. And we see these girls, they have this huge burden placed upon them after they deal with Jeffrey Epstein. And we've seen it numerous times in girls that have even come forward, how they turn to drugs and alcohol to try and stave off the memories and try and beat back the emotions that they feel because of the abuse that they suffered. And then there are other girls like this girl we're going to talk about tonight, who slipped between the cracks, right, folks? She slipped between the cracks, and the society as a whole let her down. And it's sad to read about, it's sad to talk about, but unfortunately this is reality. And a lot of times people are slipping through the cracks, and children are slipping through the cracks, and we have to do a better job of making sure that we're more aware of what is going on around us, and not so wrapped up in the BS gaslighting that oblong box in the corner of your living room tries to get you wrapped up in. We have to make sure we're focused on the things that matter. And if this case doesn't matter, if human trafficking at the highest levels of government doesn't matter, if the abuse of children doesn't matter, then we're completely lost as a civilization. And I'm not willing to go there yet, right? I believe that Western civilization is something that is, worth fighting for at the very least, worth, standing up for. I know, as somebody who lives in a republic in the United States of America, and somebody who believes in the rule of law, even though I don't see it effectively put into place, I think that it is all of our duty to stand up when we see something like this and tell the people we've elected and tell law enforcement that it's their job to make sure that this sort of thing does not occur. And we're seeing a lot more of that now. And I think it's very important that this sort of stuff is brought to the public view and is brought into more of a public light, because there are too many people that slip through the cracks, and we have to do our best to make sure that we mitigate that. Of course, there's always going to be people who slip through the cracks. There's always going to be people like Jeffrey Epstein that figure out ways to manipulate the situation. But anytime we see it and it's so brazen and so upfront, we have to call it out. Among the stories from dozens of victims of pedophile financier Jeffrey Epstein, the untold tale of Lee Patrick's descent into a personal, drug-fueled hell on earth stands out in its horror. And again, there has to be numerous stories like this. It's very sad for this gal Lee Patrick's family to have to go on record and relive this and talk about this again. But I think that their voice adds to the growing narrative that's demanding justice. And I think that they're giving voice to the numerous nameless girls that have not been able to come forward, or whose family hasn't felt comfortable coming forward and sharing their case. I think that this is going to be very important going forward, and maybe even set a precedent for some of the other families of girls who have suffered the same fate, for them to come forward and also speak out on the record. Christian school graduate Patrick, who told DailyMail.com in an unpublished interview about her relationship with a multi-millionaire pervert in 2015, was found dead in a room in a sleazy West Palm Beach motel just weeks short of her 30th birthday on May 30th, 2017. You know, that's unfortunately a very typical story here in America. A lot of us have lost loved ones to drug addiction, and a lot of us have lost loved ones to situations just exactly like this. But when you add the other factor into it, the fact that she was abused by Jeffrey Epstein and abandoned and by the justice system, and she saw that justice was never going to be served, and then you put that into what we know here about her overdosing and being addicted to heroin, and it's impossible to see that the two don't correlate. Right? We understand that basic human nature is what took over here, and she was obviously trying to repress those feelings and the trauma that she suffered, and she got caught up in the drug game. I know personally I've seen it happen to a ton of people that weren't suffering from trauma. I've seen it happen to a lot of people I care about, and it's not an easy thing to see. It's not a pleasant thing to see, to watch your friends or your loved ones battle with drugs and battle with addiction and basically kill themselves right in front of your eyes. But there's nothing you really can do. You're helpless in that situation until the person is ready to get help. And then you add the trauma on top of that, and you have yourself a situation that is almost impossible to navigate without professional help. And while her death was ruled accidental by the local medical examiner's office and blamed on the opiate crisis, both a family member and a friend described Patrick's death as the conclusion of a chain of events kicked off by her alleged encounters with Epstein more than 15 years ago. It's definitely the type of thing that can begin a spiral into the abyss, right? Getting some trauma like that when you're a young girl, and then having to live with it. You can't tell anybody about it. And then if she had, maybe she had some underlying mental illness already, maybe some anxiety or depression or whatever it may be, it could have just been exasperated by this whole entire thing and just exploded, right? Look, I don't have any medical evidence proving that. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm just going by what we're reading here in the article, analyzing what we're reading here in the article, and applying it to, the day-to-day world and the things that we see on a day-to-day basis within the opiate crisis here in America, because it's definitely a big deal. But what's never addressed and what is just as important is not so much the addiction, it's the underlying cause of the addiction. The underlying cause of the addiction is very rarely addressed, and that is something that totally needs to be talked about, and it needs to be addressed if you're going to help the person who is suffering from the addiction. She struggled with addiction since the time she met that guy. She went to rehab several times. She fought hard, but she eventually succumbed to the addiction. We miss her. It's tough. It's tough when you lose somebody you care about to an overdose, and it's frustrating, it's maddening, you don't know what to do, you're at the end of your rope. You've done everything in your power to help these people, and this is still the result. And again, you add the trauma of being assaulted by Epstein on top of it, and it's just a bomb waiting to explode. And just like they said here, she tried to get help several times and it didn't work. She fought hard, but some people just get so caught up. Their mental illness from the trauma as well as the drug addiction, it grabs hold and then that's it. There's no way to get out of it. And again, there must be so many girls that have suffered at Epstein's hands, that have struggled the same way that she has struggled here. It's crazy. It's crazy now when we read this article to put a face to it, because before we were just like, oh, just it's an unnamed person, an unnamed girl, but now we have a name, right? Lee Patrick. She was, somebody who fit the whole entire bill that we were discussing, that we would describe, the unknown girl who suffered at Epstein's hands and then disappeared, that we never heard from again. How many other girls suffered this fate? And I think about this a lot. This is something that I ponder quite a bit, because it's really hard to get to the bottom of that, right? How do you figure that out? How do you trace that down? How do you vet that? Without just an abundance of resources, it'd be very difficult to go after that. And even with an abundance of resources, it would be hard to track that down. Epstein, a Wall Street financier, pedophile, with more than $100 million in properties in Manhattan, Palm Beach, and elsewhere, was arrested on July 6th on federal charges of sex trafficking. The arrest has shaken the political establishment to its core because Epstein, a friend of President Donald Trump and former President Bill Clinton, has been accused of sharing some of his underage victims with other powerful men. Yeah, look, there's no doubt about it. He has definitely been accused of that, and we're talking people at the highest levels of government. We're talking people in Israeli politics, American politics, royals over in England. We're talking about, him being really good friends with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, his ties to Austria. We're talking about an intercontinental enterprise here, folks. This is a guy that was surrounded by power players. In the mid-2000s, Palm Beach police investigated Epstein and accused him of recruiting and paying dozens of girls, many of them troubled and some of them as young as 14, from working-class neighborhoods for sex in a dungeon at his waterfront mansion. Yeah, the story is as old as time itself. The elite preying on the working class. The elite preying on those that they deem less worthy than them. And that's what this story breaks down to, right? Jeffrey Epstein, part of the so-called elite New York upper crust society, looked at everybody else as his plaything and everybody else as a piece on a chessboard, as was you saw the example of that at his house, how he had his employees carved into likenesses of chess pieces, and they were moved around on the chessboard as if they were pieces to be played with. And that's how Epstein viewed everything. It was just his playground, and everybody was a piece on the chessboard for him to move as he saw fit. The then Palm Beach County State Attorney Barry Krischer and federal prosecutors led at the time by now former U.S. Labor Secretary Alex Acosta worked out what had been called the sweetheart deal with Epstein's high-powered legal team. It also allowed the pedophile to plead guilty to misdemeanor prostitution charges. Again, that's gross. These weren't prostitutes, these were young girls. These were young high school age girls, and this guy was in his 50s, however old he was. Bringing them in and enticing them with, money knowing that they come from underprivileged backgrounds, from broken homes, and playing on that and using that to his advantage to bring them into his atmosphere, to groom them, and then use them as he saw fit before discarding them? They weren't prostitutes, okay? They were girls that were abused by a sick, disgusting pervert. Acosta, after being asked by Democrats and Republicans, resigned from his government position on Friday as details of the Epstein deal continue to roll out. In 2008, Epstein served 13 months of an 18-month sentence in a county jail where he only reported to his cell after business hours and on weekends. Every weekday morning during his sentence, Epstein's chauffeured limo picked him up outside the jail and drove him to a fancy downtown West Palm Beach office so that he could continue conducting Wall Street business. Because we all know, right? Wall Street business was the most important thing in the world, right? Got to make sure that Wall Street business continues. Money over lives. It's gross. That whole entire way of thinking is gross. I'm not a fan of it. It's not proper thinking. There's no humanity behind it. And guys like Jeffrey Epstein think that way. He doesn't care about it. He didn't care, I should say, about anybody else or anything else. Every move he made was self-serving. Every bit of money he donated, every move he made was about his self-preservation and consolidating his power and how it would serve him down the line. Patrick was not a limo kind of girl. She rode in a friend's aging car to travel the 17 miles from her childhood home in working-class Lake Worth, Florida, to Epstein's $15 million house. Patrick's name became public when she was subpoenaed to testify in one of a series of lawsuits filed by survivors against Epstein. And when Daily Mail contacted her for an interview in 2015, she agreed to talk about the first time she ended up at Epstein's mansion. She admitted then to battling an addiction to drugs, but she was clean and sober after a stint in rehab and had just applied for a job selling insurance. I don't think it matters if she was addicted to drugs. Does that make what happened to her any less important? Does that make her story any less important? It doesn't make it any less credible either. That was how Dershowitz and even the prosecution destroyed the case in the first place, by saying these girls were drug addicts, or they were, flirting with boys on MySpace, or talking about partying, or whatever nonsensical BS they could come up with. So when somebody is on drugs, that doesn't make them less of a person who could be victimized, right? Or somebody that could be abused. So it's important that, we don't need to preface that. I don't think that's important. I mean, this is a human being. They might be on drugs, but they're still a human being, right? They should be listened to. Now, of course, when somebody's messed up on drugs, it definitely goes to to their credibility, and a good lawyer is going to exploit that for sure. But that doesn't mean that their story shouldn't be listened to. A lawyer, their job is to try and exploit the case, right? But it's the prosecution's job to combat that. And we didn't see that with Kersher. We saw the way he just jumped on board, him and his team, and they were helping destroy the credibility of the witness. That's not how that's supposed to work. At the time, she revealed she was engaged and was planning on marrying her son's father. Patrick admitted to being a wild teenager who used alcohol despite the state's drinking age of 21. Breaking news, so did I, and I'm sure so did most of you out there listening to the podcast. You mean to tell me at 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, you weren't pounding back Brews or Boone's Farm or Mad Dog 2020 or Night Train or whatever your drink of choice was? Come on. I grew up in New York for the first, bit of my life, and then for my formative years, I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. We were definitely drinking at that age. It didn't make us bad people, right? It didn't make us, liars, or it was just what teenagers do. And for them to try and use that against them, it doesn't pass the sniff test with me because it's hypocritical at best. I was at Wellington Christian School when this first happened, with Jeffrey, Patrick explained, as her son Jaden, then 3, played nearby. It was sometime in 2003. I was at a party one night at a school friend's house when this other girl, a friend, said we should go to a house party in Palm Beach. I was slightly buzzed, so I said, why not? When we got there, my friend left in a hurry, and there I was alone in that big mansion. There was no party going on. The house, she said, seemed to be occupied only by Epstein and a woman who appeared to work for him. The woman took me into a large bathroom, Patrick said, and Jeffrey was already there with a towel around his waist. That's how many times have we heard the same story from these girls who ended up being abused by Epstein. How many times have we heard the same exact scenario play out? So again, what it does is it lends credence to what she was talking about. Remember, this is in 2015 when she gave this interview. So she's talking about the same things we've heard from all of these other survivors, and this interview was never released until recently. So again, it adds credence to what all of the survivors are saying, and it adds to the pool of evidence that they're being truthful. I remember he had a black and white photo of a dick on the wall. I thought the whole thing was creepy. Patrick claimed Epstein gave her $300 cash and talked her into removing her shirt. She did, but when he allegedly asked her to take off her bra, she declined. He was getting aggressive about what he wanted, Patrick said, and I got really uncomfortable, so I grabbed my shirt and left. There was little doubt where this was going, and I ran out of the house and into the street. I left because I was a scared 16-year-old, she said. I ran out because he was so creepy, he scared the life out of me. Patrick said she went back to see Epstein but didn't want to discuss it. It makes me angry just thinking about it, she said. And do you blame her for being angry thinking about it? I mean, a 16-year-old girl, she goes over to this guy's house, and this is what happens to her when she goes over there on the pretense that she's going to some sort of party? And who are the people that brought her over there for this party? What sort of friend does that? I mean, there's just a lot of scumbaggery going on in the world, and it's really depressing, isn't it? In 2008, as local news media reported Epstein pleaded guilty to minor charges, she called one of his lawyers and demanded money for what he'd done. In time, she told DailyMail.com she didn't want to file a lawsuit, but still got a $50,000 settlement that included a clause she could never discuss what happened at the mansion. She said a friend of hers sued Epstein under the name AC and also received $50,000. And Epstein would gladly pay out $50,000. $50,000 was nothing to Jeffrey Epstein. To keep these girls quiet and to keep these stories behind closed doors, he was more than willing to throw out the $50,000. My question is, was Darren Indyke involved in that? And if so, wouldn't this be paying off witnesses? How does he get away with it, folks? How did this man get away with it for so long? These poor girls were kept silent with these payoffs, and $50,000 is a lot of money when you ain't got nothing, right? When you have nothing, when you don't have anything, and you have a child, and you have responsibilities, and you have this trauma hanging over you, someone offers you $50,000 to sign an NDA, it's difficult not to do that. And I'm sure a lot of these girls that I call the nameless girls are girls that did that. And I don't blame them one bit. Don't confuse me at all, because we're not walking in their shoes. We have no idea what they've went through, how rough it's been on them. So somebody, the $50,000, especially when they see that justice hasn't come so far, why should they believe justice is going to come at all? Might as well take the $50,000 at the very least, get that bit of validation. And that's what Lee did here. She took that $50,000, and you know what? I do not blame her for 1 second. I would have done the same exact thing. DailyMail.com contacted AC this week, but she asked through her husband to remain anonymous. I don't blame her either. Why would you not want to remain anonymous in this case? Unless you're somebody like Bradley Edwards or somebody that's right in the eye of the storm, remaining anonymous is your best bet because you don't want to get swept up in all of this madness. AC claimed in her 2008 lawsuit that she was 17 years old when she was seduced by Epstein into performing acts of lewd and lascivious conduct for Epstein, who also touched her breasts and genitalia. Again, we know that that's how Jeffrey Epstein liked to roll as well. He was a very handsy, touchy kind of guy, and we see this same kind of story from several of the girls. And it's pathetically sad to know that they could have been stopped, and this all could have been stopped. But it wasn't because they didn't listen to Maria Farmer and Annie Farmer when they should have. AC's husband, who also asked not to be identified, said his wife handled the aftermath of her ordeal well, but she was one of the lucky ones. I've been with my wife since high school, and many of our friends ended up at Epstein's house, he said. We're married and we have jobs and children. But for a few of the girls who were abused, they didn't turn out so good. He really messed with these girls' heads. There's been psychological scars that led to substance abuse. Right there, folks. So AC's husband is telling us right there that there's other girls that we don't know about. I mean, we can assume, right? And I've speculated here on the podcast that there has to be, according to the evidence. And if you mathematically, it just doesn't seem feasible that this isn't the case. But again, when we hear it from somebody who firsthand knowledge, it carries more weight, right? He named Patrick as one of the most egregious cases. Patrick's nude body was found by the cleaning crew, who sawed off the door handle in order to get inside. Man, this is hard to even read. This is hard to even read. She was partly covered with a sheet while on a twin bed at the Treetops Motel in May 2017, where Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office deputies routinely run undercover sex-for-sale sting operations. So who knows what this poor girl was going through, man. And it's really sad to read that her final hours were spent like that in some seedy hotel, motel, by herself or with God knows who. And it's so sad to think about. It really is. It's really, really upsetting. The corpse, according to the lengthy sheriff's office report, was covered with bruises, abrasions, and open wounds. The deputies at the scene also noted open sores. Deputies tracked down a man who had been renting the room where Patrick's body was found, and he told them he was driving out of the motel property when he picked up Patrick as she ran down the street. Wow. Little pause here, folks. This poor girl, all this trauma, all of this nonsense she's been through, and this is how she ends up. And this is what her life ended up being after dealing with Jeffrey Epstein and being caught in the grips and the clutches of this disgusting animal. And, you know, it's sobering to read stuff like this. You know, we read about statistics and, you know, unnamed person was hurt here or there. But when you start putting a face to it and you start hearing the stories behind it, it's heartbreaking to imagine this family and what they're going through and how they suffered, knowing that they were helpless to help their loved one after the assault, during when the assault was happening, and then after the assault when they fell into the clutches of drug addiction. He told authorities she looked like she may have been beaten and was obviously under the influence of drugs. He said she agreed to go back to his room so she could take a shower and clean up her wounds. In the room, the man told deputies he witnessed Patrick getting high while sitting on the toilet. She'd been hiding baggies filled with a white powder in her bra. When she passed out, he said he flushed the drugs into the toilet and threw out her glass pipe in the garbage. She was snoring on the bed when he left to check out. He told deputies he figured she'd eventually wake up, which she didn't. I don't know about all of that. I hope that they were more thorough with this guy. Doesn't seem like the kind of story I'm buying, right? Seems like maybe he was involved a little bit more with her. Now, I'm not saying he killed her or anything like that, but it just doesn't seem feasible to me. He picks her up out of the kindness of his heart at this seedy hotel, brings her back to his place. She starts doing drugs or whatever. She passes out. He splits after he throws out her dope and her works. Doesn't add up to me. I'm not a detective or anything, but I did watch The Wire. I mean, really it sounds kind of odd. I hope that they, dug a little deeper into this guy. Her son Jaden, who turned 7 years old later this month, was left under the care of her twin sister Selby. You know, AC's husband said, the system may have failed them twice, once in letting Epstein go and a second time failing to provide some kind of support. Yeah, AC, you're right on, buddy. I agree with you 100%, pal. Palm Beach County records show Patrick was arrested 12 times in the 14 years between the time of her encounters with Epstein and her death. Her rap sheet included possession of cocaine, domestic battery, resisting arrest, battery on a law enforcement officer, and assault. In 2017, she was arrested outside her sister's house and charged with trespassing. She had been banned from the property after her attempts to see her young son, who was in her sister's custody, turned violent. According to records, Patrick pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 17 days in the county slammer. She was found dead 2 weeks after her release. And we see that quite a bit with drug addicts as well. They'll do a stint in jail, and especially heroin addicts, and then they'll come out of jail and they'll try and score, and they might get a hot bag, and they'll shoot that heroin up, and they'll overdose. There'll be too much fentanyl in it, maybe, or it'll be too strong for them after their system has had a chance to kick the heroin tolerance, the opiate tolerance that it had built inside of its system. Once it has a chance to kick that, they go back and they try and nail the same sort of shot that they would have previously, and it's too much for them, and they overdose. And the people that they're with are like, you know what, we don't want to get arrested, so we're just going to leave you here to die. And they split. They don't call the cops, and then that person dies. How do I know something like that happens? It's happened in my own family. So I know how that happens and how that works for sure. And I certainly know what it's like to lose a loved one due to an overdose. So my heart definitely goes out to her family in this situation. Not only were they victimized by Jeffrey Epstein for all of that time, they were also victimized by the vicious cycle of the opiate epidemic just sweeping through the nation. So it's a sobering read, and it's tough to talk about stuff like this, but we have to remember that these are real people, and these girls without a voice, they deserve to be heard. So with Lee Patrick's family coming out and speaking out like this and telling their story, and the Daily Mail running this article, what it does is hopefully lets others know that they're not alone, right? And there's resources for people who have been through this sort of trauma, and there are a lot of really good people working on this case, especially that these girls can reach out to. I'm sure that all of the lawyers working the case will help them with the proper resources and help them get whatever help they need. And, there are resources out there. So hopefully some of these unnamed girls will come forward and they will let their story be heard. And they will also be given a chance to get some reparations in the form of a monetary payout to help them, with the financial burden. Because how many of them have spent money out of their own pocket to go seek therapy for this? I'm sure a lot of them. So I think them getting, a monetary payout would help ease the burden, at least financially, and perhaps maybe let them focus on moving forward with their lives and trying to put this behind them, as opposed to scratching and clawing every day, worrying about, the how I'm going to pay for my therapy as well as my child's kindergarten or, nursery school or whatever it may be. So I think that stories like this are important because it gives other people courage to also let their stories be known and bring their stories out to the public. All right, folks, if you'd like to contact me, you could do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. If you haven't listened to my newest podcast yet, make sure you check that out. You can find the link here in the description box. And the name of the podcast is COVID-19, the pandemic that changed everything. So if you haven't given that a listen yet, make sure you do that. If that's something you're interested in, if that's a topic that you're following closely, you don't want to miss what I have to offer over there, folks. All right, everybody, I will be back tomorrow, and we will have episode 4 in our Core 4 series ready to go, as well as the daily drop. All right, everybody, until then, I hope you all have a safe and good evening.